Our topic tonight is monarchy, past and present. I've been thinking about this topic of monarchy because of the recent coronation that the United Kingdom held, the very first one that occurred in 70 years. So King Charles III and the Queen Consort Camilla were both crowned in this very ancient and also, I guess, a little bit updated, but it didn't seem that updated anyway, but also televised ceremony that is in a little ways a little bit out of time in a way. It's also pretty alien to our current, let's say, post-tradition or post-formal society. When I was a kid, older people still in English in the United States and would call, kids would call elders Mr. So-and-so, Mr. by the surname, or Mrs. So-and-so. And so people would call my dad Mr. Hamer and so on. I'm not really in a place anymore. That's gone. And so I'm very rarely called Mr. Hamer in, these kind of formalisms have been lost in our society, even little things like that, minor titles and so forth. And so in some ways, these kinds of costumes that we see Charles and Camilla wearing are almost like Halloween dress up, because we don't do costumes and dress up otherwise. But the only exception to that is, in fact, actually, it's not costume jewelry. So this crown that Charles is wearing is real. So it's the imperial state crown of the United Kingdom, and it all by itself, because of all of the jewels and diamonds and ruby and so forth that are all in it, has an estimated value of somewhere between $4 to $6 billion. So it's quite a expensive artifact that he's actually wearing. Okay, so in some ways, it makes me think, as this exists, is this kind of a living institutional fossil? Some of the traditions here are dating back 1,000 years, and the British monarchy feels like something from a different era. Charles is the 40th monarch to be crowned in Westminster Abbey since William the Conqueror back in 1066. And in the 21st century, it does seem pretty odd for one of the world's leading democracies to have as its head of state a person who inherited that position as a lifelong office, having inherited it from his mother. What's even more peculiar, as someone who is a Canadian citizen, it's even more strange to think that Charles is now King of Canada and king of 13 other Commonwealth realms. So Antigua and Barbuda, Australia, the Bahamas, Belize, Grenada, Jamaica, New Zealand, Papua New Guinea, St. Kitts and Nevis, Santa Lucia, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, the Solomon Islands, and Tuvalu. So mostly a bunch of little countries, little island countries, but a couple big ones left, like Australia and Canada. This is a map of the current and former Commonwealth realms. So the ones that I just read off are in blue, and you can kind of see that there are a whole bunch of other ones that were maybe more significant that have subsequently removed the British monarch as their head of state and have become republics. So India and Pakistan and Bangladesh and South Africa, Nigeria, Kenya, Tanzania, and so forth. Some sort of quite big countries. Ireland, the Republic of Ireland. The number of Commonwealth realms and dominions has continued to be declining. So, as I say, 19 former realms have become republics, and indeed, since the Queen's death, the former Queen Elizabeth, Jamaica, the Bahamas, Antigua and Barbuda, among others, have actually announced their intention of holding referenda in order to decide whether they are going to ditch the monarchy and just simply become republics, the way the other former monarchy Commonwealth realms have done. And indeed, even before the Queen's death, Prince William and his wife had made kind of they'd made a trip to Jamaica that ended up having a bunch of I don't know, ended up having a bunch of protests. Here's a strange situation where the heirs to the throne of the head of state for the Kingdom of Jamaica are the European former colonizers of a post-colonial people, and so that isn't always sitting well with the local people, the Jamaicans. So here's another example. Prince William and Princess Catherine in 2021. They're visiting the Solomon Islands, and they're in a ceremony that I think the people of the Solomon Islands maybe came up with themselves and so forth. But nevertheless, the optics of it, the imagery of them being carried on the backs of the post-colonial people, isn't the best. And so, in any event, retaining a monarchy, even a totally symbolic monarchy like the British monarchy, for post-colonial peoples has even additional complexities than, say, it has in pluralistic societies like Canada and Australia. So for the scope of the presentation that we have tonight, I want to look at, so what is monarchy and what are the different types of monarchy? I want to also look at, okay, well, what's the difference between a monarchy and a republic? Because it's not as straightforward as you might think, because obviously some monarchies are democracies, like Canada and the UK and Japan, whereas some republics are autocracies, like mainland China and Russia, for example. So how do monarchs differ from dictators and other heads of state? And I also want to take a kind of a little bit of a deep dive into how the British monarchs evolved. How did that over time, from they were once the actual rulers, the heads of the government of Britain or England and Scotland, separately from each other. How did they then become entirely ceremonial heads of state? So where we are now in the 21st century, there are multiple different kinds of monarchies that are pretty different from one another. We've already talked about here in green or light green, the British monarchy and all the Commonwealth realms like Canada and Australia and so forth. That's a constitutional monarchy. There are here in this map in dark green a bunch of other monarchies that are constitutional monarchies in Scandinavia and Spain and Japan and Southeast Asia and so forth. Then there are monarchies that are kind of called semi-constitutional monarchies. So these are monarchies where the monarch still retains a bunch of governmental authority, but is ruling, let's say, in conjunction with some kind of democratically elected parliament or council or something like that, that the monarch then has some powers over, but has given or has devolved some powers to that democratically elected council. Then we have in red on here absolute monarchies, so where the monarch has absolute authority over the realm and does not have any, at least de jure, legal checks or balances. There may be some de facto traditional checks and balances and so forth. There almost always are in human societies, but in terms of the legal philosophy, the absolute monarchies have all power. And then in pink, we're also listing here on this map what are called subnational monarchies. And so this is occasions or places where there's a traditional monarch, somebody who will have been a prince or king or something like that, of a place or people, and that people are a nationality that doesn't have a full country. So in other words, they are one of the tribal peoples living within South Africa being a much bigger country, and so therefore they're not the king of all of South Africa, but are simply claiming to be the king of a people who live within South Africa and who are citizens of South Africa, for example. So constitutional monarchies. These are also what I was just calling like ceremonial monarchies, a monarch where the monarch has no power, it's simply a ceremonial position. So although the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland lacks a written constitution, its monarchy is called constitutional because nearly every last iota of its power has passed from the king, who remains the ceremonial head of state, to the parliament and its prime minister, who forms the head of government. And so we see here King Charles III meeting with Rishi Sunak, who is the current prime minister of the United Kingdom. And so famously, even down to, if you've been watching The Crown, TV show about Queen Elizabeth and her reign, British monarchs are really supposed to avoid if expressing any kind of political sentiments at all, because their role as sovereign is to rise above partisan political divisions. And so if if on the TV show The Crown she's having a fight with Margaret Thatcher over whether or not to condemn the apartheid government in South Africa or something like that, this is not something she's supposed to be doing in public. That would be a scandal for it to happen in public, because that's the prerogative, not the prerogative of the monarch to express a political sentiment like that. There are a bunch of other constitutional monarchies, as we mentioned, outside of Britain and the Commonwealth Realms. So this is again where the monarch has limited or wholly ceremonial roles. So other examples include Japan, and this is a picture here of Naruhito, the current emperor of Japan, with his wife, the Empress Masako. Thailand, Cambodia, Bhutan, Spain, Belgium, the Netherlands, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and Andorra. Those are all constitutional monarchies. Andorra is a little micro state that exists between Spain and France, and Andorra has the weird constitutional quirk that its monarch, its prince, it actually has a set of co-princes, and they are the people on either side of the border. So the Bishop of Urgel in Spain is one of the co-princes, and so whoever the current bishop is, that's one of the co-princes of Andorra. And then it had been a local count on the French side, but it became the French king, and now that France is a republic, it's now the president of France. And so Emmanuel Macron is the other co-prince of Andorra, so an elected president is prince of it, that very quirky principality. So, like the British monarchy, most constitutional monarchies have evolved out of earlier systems where the monarch exercised actual power in the state. So at different times in Japanese history, the emperor actually was the head of government, although the role became more religious and more ceremonial and exercise. And so, for example, power went into the hands of warlords, including, for example, like the shogun in the shogun era, and the emperor had different levels of power. For example, as recently as World War II, more power than has now, and but still was not in charge at that time. So, for example, though in the most recent example of this, it's only since 2005 that Bhutan, which is a kind of a Himalayan state that's wedged between China and Tibet and India, has transitioned from being an absolute monarchy to a semi-constitutional monarchy, and are almost moving towards an entirely constitutional monarchy. So the previous king introduced a constitution that limited his own powers, and then he retired, he abdicated in favor of his son, who became the new king, and the new king is now more of a constitutional monarch. And this is a picture of the current king of Bhutan. So historically, monarchies have been extremely personal institutions whose power can wax and wane with the incumbent monarch. And so it's kind of very frequent that if a king may well be very, very powerful, he might have a son who is less suited to that, who takes over for him, and spends most of his time hunting or in the harem or something like that. So in other words, that he is not actually leading the troops and things like that. What can then happen is a major official, his vizier, a warlord, a shogun, the major domo, the mayor of the palace, somebody like that can start to take over and start exercising all of the power, and the monarchy itself can become more or less ceremonial, even without a democracy forming. In other words, that the power can pass to some other official. And so an example of this is after founding the medieval Frankish kingdom, the Merovingian dynasty, the original kings of the Franks, they ended up they had a bunch of succession issues where they would divide the monarchy up, and they would have rival kings that would fight wars with each other. That led to there being a succession of, let's say, boy kings, kings that were crowned or inherited the throne as very young children, and then often didn't make it too much into adulthood. They'll have another child, and then there will be a succession then of kings who are minors, who are not adults, who are able to exercise full control. During that time then, the royal power, almost all of the prerogatives of the king, including leading the army and so forth, began to be collected by their, what he was actually what called in Latin major domo, which means mayor of the palace. And these are effectively like your chief minister. And then that noble house, the Carolingians, took all the power, and then ultimately, when they had essentially deprived the kings of any power, the Carolingian, he's not a king, but the Carolingian mayor of the palace wrote to the Pope and asked, well, Your Holiness, isn't it true that the person with the power should also wear the crown? And the Pope, who needed an ally and wanted to have military support of the Frankish kingdom, knew better than to say no to that. And so he writes and says, yes, absolutely. And so the last Merovingian king, had his hair cut off, and he was put into a monastery, made a tonsure and put into a monastery. And the mayor of the palace then took the crown, and the Carolingians family, the family of Charlemagne, became the kings of the Franks. And that alliance with the popes actually went on, and so the later popes actually revived the West Roman Empire and crowned Charlemagne emperor. We have a whole lecture on Charlemagne and the Western Empire. Another example of this are actually both sets of caliphs, both the Abbasid caliphs in Baghdad and also the Fatimid caliphs of Egypt. They experienced a similar loss of power. The Fatimids took place later, so their loss takes place in the 12th century. Again, succession of boy caliphs. The viziers, in this case, their chief officer, took over all government control and began ruling as sultans. Again, head of the military, head of government, leaving the caliph as sort of like a religious leader. So somebody who had been sort of a kind of king emperor becomes a sort of a figurehead pope kind of guy without any power, until ultimately deprived of any power. Actually, in 1171, a sultan, the famous Saladin, actually abolished the Fatimid dynasty altogether and simply established his own dynasty as a sultanate in Egypt. This is another example. The collapse of the authority of the Holy Roman Emperors in the later Middle Ages led to the total Balkanization of Italy and Germany in the early modern period. So it can happen that nobody takes power, and instead the realm kind of divides itself into chaos, and so that kind of a thing, and little independent realms emerge, like the disunified states of Italy and Germany in the early modern era. So one of the kinds of monarchies that is current in the 21st century are these semi-constitutional monarchies. So in several cases, the monarch has given up fewer powers than the king of Bhutan gave up, and so that has put them in sort of this semi-constitutional status. So, for example, in 2011, in the wake of the whole Arab Spring, where there was kind of clamor across the Arab world for the different either absolute monarchies or military dictatorships and so forth that existed, to have some kind of democratic input on the part of the peoples of those Arab nations. The King of Morocco allowed the creation of a constitution that includes having an elected parliament, but he himself, though, retained control of the armed forces, the judiciary, appointments to make judges and so forth, the right to appoint and dismiss prime ministers from the largest elected party to parliament. So in other words, it's still a monarchy. There's some constitutional elements here, but the monarch is still in a lot of charge, and so therefore it's semi-constitutional, right? Other examples of semi-constitutional monarchies include the European microstates of Liechtenstein and Monaco. So while Liechtenstein has an elected legislature, its prince retains the right to veto legislation that it passes, and also to dissolve the parliament. So to get rid of the legislature and have it call new elections. The Prince of Monaco also has veto power over legislation and is also in charge of appointing the judiciary in Monaco. So in other words, it's a little bit strange because we think of Western Europe in general as being, pretty much all democracies, but in these two little microstates, there's actually still hereditary monarchs that retain a bunch of power. And there's a handful of monarchies in the 21st century that are absolute monarchies. This is places where all of the state's de jure power, all the legal power, is in the hands of the monarch. So in these systems, there may be some checks on the monarch's power, but these are largely informal or customary or de facto. So in other words, it may be that if King Salman of Saudi Arabia, who has by law absolute power within his realm, nevertheless, if he does certain things, then all of the rest of the royal family, the rest of the Saudi royal family, may protest and cause a bunch of problems. And so in other words, there are certain things that he maybe won't do, even though he technically could do anything, because of that. In other words, there's an informal checks. There's another absolute monarchies include Brunei, Eswatini in Africa and South Africa, Oman, Saudi Arabia, the individual emirates of the United Arab Emirates, and then most kind of interestingly or surprisingly, the microstate in Italy in Rome of Vatican City. So just on the board here then, we've already had looked before at the Commonwealth Realms. This is kind of just showing the other constitutional monarchies, the areas where there are semi-constitutional monarchies, absolute monarchies, and then, like we mentioned, subnational monarchies. So in some cases, there's a traditional monarchy that continues to operate, like I say, in a territory that is not an independent state. And so, in other words, the monarch only claims some level of leadership over a portion of the people or territory within the state. So we have Nababango II is the current king of one of the Mossi peoples in the country of Burkina Faso, but certainly not intending he's the ruler of Ouagadougou, I guess, which is one of the Mossi kingdoms. So it's not all of Burkina Faso, but just a little portion of it, and so forth. So he has a respected role among his people, but is not monarch of a state. In terms of subnational monarchies, there's a really interesting and weird system in Malaysia. So 9 of the states that make up Malaysia are headed by traditional Malay rulers. Excuse me. Most of these monarchs have the title Sultan, although there's a couple have local titles as well. And so they're kind of all subnational monarchs. In other words, they're monarch of their little state only, or their sultanate only. However, every 5 years, these 9 rulers convene a conference of rulers to elect from among themselves the Yang di Pertuan, I can't pronounce Malaysian, but anyway, Agong. In other words, the paramount ruler of the Malaysian Federation, who is then the overall constitutional monarch of Malaysia. And so, so even though each of these sultans or other princes are not the monarch of all of Malaysia, they can be, you know, if they amongst themselves are elected to be the paramount ruler. Okay, so just that's a summary of, you know, the different kinds of monarchies in the 21st century, and what we really see about that is that it's really not about power, because there's a bunch of the monarchies, like we see with King Charles III in the United Kingdom, there's no powers. In other words, he has a strictly ceremonial role. You know, and on the other end of that, there are people like Sultan Haitham of Oman. In other words, a person who has absolute monarchy and has all the power constitutionally of the state. You know, he's in charge of and can do anything. The law flows from him and so forth. He's in charge of every component of it. And then in between, there are these semi-constitutional monarchies. In other words, where the monarch retains some governing role. And we saw that, for example, Prince Albert II of Monaco is one of those who is somewhere in between on that spectrum. And if we just compare then monarchs to other heads of states in republics, that is also can be the case. So, for example, on the one end of this, in Germany, Germany is a democracy, and in Germany is a republic, and the Germans elect a legislature, of which the head of the legislature, the chancellor, is also essentially the head of the government and is in charge of all those kind of things. But there is also a president of Germany that is an entirely ceremonial role, a person that doesn't have any power at all. And so they fulfill essentially the role that the King of England has, but it is simply, again, a ceremonial role as president of Germany. You know, at the other end of it, People's Republic of China, Xi Jinping is has increasingly, there used to be more checks on his power in terms of the Communist Party apparatus, but he's increasingly removed all those and has gathered all power to himself. And so he's become essentially president of a republic, a person that has essentially absolute power, absolute control. There are some, again, checks and balances on him, but it's pretty little at this point. Whereas in between, there would be someone like Emmanuel Macron, the president of France. There's some, you know, countries that have a presidential system like the United States or Turkey or France, where there is a parliament and a prime minister that has a lot of control, or Congress, you know, that has a lot of control of the legislature and so forth. But then there's an independently elected executive, which has control of some things like maybe foreign policy and military and so forth. And so in that sense, the head of state in republics can also be on this power spectrum. So it's really not about in either one of these cases, you know, whether you have absolute power or not. So if the difference between monarchs and other heads of states is not about power, since monarchs exist everywhere on the power spectrum from absolute power to no power, and likewise, we pointed out here that the difference between monarchies and republics is unrelated to democracy, since many monarchies, like Denmark here, are fully democratic states, while many republics are complete autocracies where there is no input of the people in terms of into the government. The government is totally self-contained and so forth. So just trying to detach here, you know, like what's the distinction here between both of those. And so in some sense, it's not about power and it's not about democracy. Is it about heredity? So in Monty Python and the Holy Grail, there's a funny scene where King Arthur comes and meets a couple peasants, and one of the peasants asked, well, wait, how did you become king then? I didn't vote for you. And Arthur says, you don't vote for kings. He said, the lady of the lake, her arm clad in the purest shimmering shamite, held aloft Excalibur from the bosom of the water, signifying that by divine providence that I, Arthur, was to carry Excalibur, the sword, and that is why I am your king. And then the peasant replied, here, look, listen, strange women lying in ponds distributing swords is no basis for a system of government. Supreme executive power derives from a mandate from the masses, not from some farcical aquatic ceremony, which Arthur then proceeds to, anyway, not like this kind of pushback. So here is a case where, monarchy here is essentially deriving from tradition, custom, divine providence, these kind of arguments, as opposed to, in this case, a mandate, just to say popular support from the citizenry. Nevertheless, although maybe familiarity with the British monarchy that we have in North America, since we pay attention to, even the people in the United States pay a lot of attention to the British royal family, and the Canadians, of course, the British royal family is their monarchy. So there is a familiarity with that, which maybe leads to the popular impression that monarchies are naturally hereditary. In other words, in that they always pass by primogeniture. So in other words, Queen Elizabeth's firstborn son is Charles. He's now the king. Charles is firstborn son. And it doesn't have to be son anymore in the British monarchy. So firstborn child. William is now the heir, and he will eventually become king when Charles dies, and so forth. Nevertheless, even though hereditary monarchies, that's one of the principles of some monarchies, there are a number of monarchies that actually have been elective traditionally. So, for example, the popes, who are the bishops of Rome, but also the chief patriarch or head of the Catholic Church, the Universal Church, they are also absolute monarchs of a internationally recognized microstate, the Vatican City. And to get that position, they don't inherit it by, being the son of the previous pope. There's some examples of that kind of thing happening in the Middle Ages and so forth, but they're not supposed to be having sons and anything like that. They're celibate priests and so forth. And so they are actually achieve their position by election. So they are elected by the College of Cardinals, the senior ecclesiastical magnates of their monarchy, of the Vatican. The monarchy of the Holy Roman Empire was also elective, and it passed actually between royal houses before ultimately the Habsburgs largely succeeded in monopolizing the crown at the end of the Middle Ages and in the early modern period. Similarly, the French crown was originally elective until the House of Capet succeeded in making it hereditary via primogeniture. So we mentioned in France, the Franks, that the Carolingians were able to displace the previous dynasty, the Merovingians, as the royal house of France, of the Franks. West Francia became France, and at a certain point, the Carolingians started losing elections among the magnates, and they got replaced by it's a family originally called the Robertines, but it's the same family, the Capetians, and it started alternating between Carolingian and Capetian monarchs until Hugh Capet was able to solidly, entrench his line, and he did that by always producing a son. That's a lucky thing. You need to do it as a king if you're trying to have a primogeniture or hereditary monarchy anyway. So always producing an heir, and in the case of the French tradition, crowning your kid while you're still alive. So in other words, you don't get to wait until the king dies and then you have some election and you don't know what's going to happen. Instead, you make your son junior king while you're still alive, and then when you die, he's already king. So you don't have to. So therefore, that you preempt any other kind of election happening. The danger of that is the kid could always rebel against you and put you, kill you or put you away in a prison or something like that. So it is a strong strategy for having your line continue, but it has its own dangers as well. we mentioned here in terms of the election, before we already talked about the paramount ruler of Malaysia. So that's an election. So that's elective monarchy where each of the hereditary subnational rulers elect one of their number for a 5-year term to be the paramount ruler. And I've already told this story without a slide, but essentially what I was saying is that, like in the West Francia of France, the Capetians, Hugh Capet here, they did a very good job of producing one heir, and usually not two, because a spare has the possibility of dividing the inheritance. So they usually sometimes had a second, but they usually only had one, and then again crowned that heir during the lifetime of the father. So monarchy, therefore, is also not necessarily about heredity. So some of the monarchies, including the papacy, are elective. And so the difference between monarchs and other heads of state is not necessarily about inheritance. And I wanted to just make a side note here about English, because I think this is an interesting aside. The word prince and princess have evolved in English to mean the son and the daughter of the king. But originally the word prince is simply a synonym for monarch. In other words, it's not a king's child. Wouldn't be called a prince. King's child would just be the son of the king. There doesn't necessarily be a word for that. The word prince would have been applied to the sovereign of a principality, in the same way the king is the sovereign of a kingdom. And so Wales is a principality, and so its leader is a prince. And so in the English case, we have this tradition of calling the children prince based on this reality of Wales. Where did the word prince come from? So ancient Rome had a really proud civic tradition. So Rome was originally a republic. It had a monarchical period in legendary times. They overthrew the monarchs. They considered them to be tyrants. They established a republic that's ruled by a senate and other elected assemblies. We actually have a whole lecture on the Roman Republic, the Roman Constitution. And from that, they shared power, especially as an oligarchy, the nobility, as members of the Senate. The Roman Constitution did include an office called dictator, which is where we get our word dictator, and which was the temporary absolute ruler. And so the idea of this and the most legendary or kind of the legendary case that proves the rule, or what everybody was supposed to do, is there was a great leader named Cincinnatus, and he's retired from public life. There's an emergency. The Gauls or the Germans or somebody's invading, something's happening, and they go to Cincinnatus. He's off at his farm, he's plowing a field. They say, the Senate has voted you to be dictator, you're now in charge. He comes back to Rome, he leads the troops, he defeats the enemy, and as soon as that's done, he resigns his position as dictator, and he goes back to his field, and he goes to the plow. And so in other words, that's how a dictator is supposed to be. It's just a temporary emergency rule, and then the goal is for the guy to then give the power back up. And so indeed, the city, Cincinnati, Ohio, is named after Cincinnatus because George Washington was trying to instill that model in the kind of the hearts of the young American republic when the U.S. was venturing into this very untested waters at the time anyway, in the late 1700s, early 1800s, of having a large state be a republic. There had been little city-states in Italy and so that had been republics, but generally speaking, European powers for most of history had been monarchies at that point. And so he wanted to himself demonstrate that he wasn't going to keep power forever. He was going to retire and go back to Mount Vernon. And same thing then, the Order of Cincinnatus, and for which Cincinnati is named, is in trying to teach that lesson. So, however, after a bunch of the conflict within different nobles competing for power in the Republic, after Julius Caesar won a civil war, the Senate voted that he could be named dictator for life. And so that already is kind of becoming, monarch, right? But there were fears that that wasn't enough for Caesar, and that he was intending to maybe take the title Rex, to take the title king. And because of that kind of fear of him overturning the Republic, that led conspirators to assassinate him, which caused another round of the Civil War. And so when Caesar's nephew, Octavian, and the other Caesarian leaders of the Caesarian party, when Octavian actually won the end of all the rest of the civil wars against the conspirators and against his own former partners, Mark Antony and so forth, he became the absolute dictator or the absolute monarch of Rome, but he specifically retained the pretense of the republic. So he wanted to disguise the fact that he held absolute power. And so he changed his name to Imperator Caesar Augustus, and the title he took is simply princeps. So he doesn't want to be called Rex, he doesn't want to be called king, he just wants to be called princeps, which is to say he's just the first. It just means first. He's first among equals in the Senate. All the other senators are still, it's still a republic and so forth, and he just has the honor of being the first one among the equals. However, even though that's a pretense, and that mollified everybody, and Augustus was able to have a good long reign and establish peace in Rome and so forth, over time, that title that he and his successors had, princeps, that evolved into our word prince, which means essentially monarch. And other titles, like he had imperator, that just meant general, that evolved into our word emperor. So when he's calling himself emperor, it didn't have the meaning that it has now. It only grew over time. And even his names he has, like Augustus and Caesar, those evolved into titles. So over time, the names for Kaiser, the German Kaiser, or the Russian Tsar, those are just derivations of the family name Caesar. So in other words, despite the fact that Augustus tried to pretend like he didn't have all power, over time, all of the names that he had to disguise power, over time, since it was very clear that the emperor, the Caesar, the Augustus, the prince had all this power, all of those words became imbued with that meaning and still have that meaning today. So, for example, Machiavelli as the prince is therefore not about the son of a king. It's another word for a monarch. He is writing to monarchs, princes of city-states in Italy, usually, is what kind of its intended audience. And he's explaining to them how to be successful rulers potentially using Machiavellian philosophy. We have a whole lecture on that. Is Machiavelli actually Machiavellian, and so forth. So initially, the sons of the kings of England were not called princes. So in the Anglo-Saxon times, there was an Anglo-Saxon word called etheling, and usually that was applied to Anglo-Saxon kings. So etheling. Local Welsh rulers, however, were called princes at the time Wales was fully conquered by King Edward, and Edward invested his son, Edward, who later became Edward II, but initially as the first English Prince of Wales. And so Wales then becomes what's called an appanage of the English crown. So it's ruled by the British monarch, or the English monarch in this case, but the title for it is essentially the ruled by the heir to the throne, and so the son of the king is always called the Prince of Wales, and that's how the word prince then gets applied to children of kings. There's a similar, even if more weirdly peculiar, linguistic tradition for the traditional appanage of the heirs to the French throne. So the rulers of Villanue, which is a large county in southeast France, they had on their shields, on their coats of arms, they had a dolphin, and they began to use the word le dauphin as their title. So they were called the dauphin, the dolphins of Villanue, as opposed to being called the count. And so when the last dauphin of Villanue, when he didn't have any more sons, they left their county to the French crown on the condition that that they keep Villanue separate, and it becomes the appanage of the heir to the French throne. And so thereafter, the son of the King of France is always called, the Dauphin. That's why he's always called the Dolphin, which is a very strange thing. So if history had been different, and we were Disney had come from France, and France wanted a republic and things like that, then all of these Disney princesses might not have been named princesses because of their association with Wales and Welshing, and they might have been called Athelings, because of their relationship to Anglo-Saxon name for prince, or the Dolphinesses, of Disney Dolphinesses. But anyway, they just bring up this strange linguistic quirk there. Okay, so the British throne currently passes by absolute primogeniture. That means the heir is the firstborn child of the monarch, and it previously passed by what's called agnatic primogeniture. In other words, that's a kind of primogeniture where sons are preferred over daughters. So essentially, the way it had always worked in the past, Henry VIII has two daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, but then he has a son, Edward. And so even though Edward is the youngest of the three, the girls are skipped, the women are skipped, and it goes to Edward. But then when Edward died, then rather than going to like one of Henry's brothers or a male cousin by a line, it goes to Henry's daughters. So Mary becomes the sovereign. She becomes the queen regnant. And then when she died without any offspring, it went to Elizabeth, who became the queen regnant. And then when she died without any offspring, then it did have to go, find a line and get all the way across to a cousin who's James Stuart, the King of Scotland, who then became King of England. So many monarchies operate not, though, by primogeniture, but instead on a principle of what's called agnatic seniority. And so what this does is actually prefers younger brothers of the king in the line of succession against the king's own sons. And that kind of thing had been happening early on in the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, and it actually was also happening a little bit in the early Angevin or Plantagenet England. So, for example, Alfred the Great, one of the greatest English kings, had been the king of Wessex, became one of the first people to be called king of all of the Anglo-Saxons. So, nevertheless, he was one of the youngest sons of his father, and he only became king after three of his older brothers served as king before him. So, in other words, his father died, his older brother became king, that guy died. It doesn't go to his young sons, it goes instead to a younger brother. That guy dies, and the next one came, and then finally Alfred. And so Alfred succeeded despite the fact that his older brothers had sons. So there are some advantages and some different disadvantages of succession by agnatic seniority. So generally speaking, monarchies are absolutely at their weakest moment is at succession. So we mentioned how the Capetians solved this by the king crowning his son as king while the old king is still alive, and they spend a bunch of time being king together until the old king dies, and then the junior king becomes senior king when the dad dies, and so forth. Then that way that would strengthened the dynasty and the monarchy, because you don't have the succession moment which is very fragile. And it's especially dangerous for a dynasty and for a monarchy in general when the successor is a minor child. And so if you do something by primogeniture, when you're always going father to son to son and so forth, the chances of people died a lot earlier in the Middle Ages and antiquity, and so the chances of getting the new king to be like even a baby or a little kid was fairly frequent. And so when that happened, you would have to have an infant king who isn't really able to perform the job, and then their mother or a great noble or one of the king's old brothers or someone would have to act as a regent for a child king. So if you don't have that, if instead the successor can be the king's adult brother, that can avoid having that kind of a regency of a child monarch. And so this happened, for example, I mentioned this happening in the early Angevin or Plantagenet era of the English monarchy, when King John's father, Henry II, died. The crown passed first to Henry's oldest still living son, Richard, the Lion-Hearted. And then next, there was a brother named Arthur, Duke of Brittany, who had a son. Sorry, it was not Arthur. Geoffrey, Duke of Brittany, who had a son named Arthur. And so Richard didn't have any kids, but there's another brother who was older than John who had a son. And so Arthur, by primogeniture, should have now been the next ruler. Instead, the crown passed to Richard's brother, John. And it's probably a shame that it did, because John was pretty much the worst king England ever had. But in any event, that's how they did it at the time, to prevent the succession of a little boy king, which Arthur would have been at the time. Nevertheless, if all the king's brothers also have the potential to be king, that can also lead to a lot more civil wars and so forth. And we saw that happening, for example, with the Merovingians, where they were all fighting each other because any one of them could be king. So one of the most famously fratricidal monarchies were the Ottoman sultanates, so the rulers of Turkey. Historians have called the Ottoman succession practice survival of the fittest, not the eldest. So Ottoman sultans practiced polygamy, and they then generated large royal families, the same way the Saudis have generated this large royal family. But upon the death of any particular reigning sultan, what would then end up happening is all of the sons would fight among themselves for the succession until one emerged as triumphant. So whoever got to Constantinople and was able to be declared sultan and so forth, they will then take the precaution, or there was a tradition that they would have all of their brothers or half-brothers strangled, so that there would be no rivals to the throne. Okay. So that's kind of my survey of the different kinds of monarchies, both from totally ceremonial to absolute that exist, and then also how succession happens from being completely elective to having primogeniture to having agnatic seniority as the means of succession. And so I also said what I wanted to do today, and this is just kind of briefly trace the evolution of how did the British monarchy in particular go from being an actual monarchy where the king actually was leader of the government, the military and so forth. How did they get to this with King Charles III, a totally powerless, entirely symbolic monarch? So the British monarchy goes back before 1066. And so part of the earliest successors are essentially founded in the collapse of Roman authority in Britain, when Germanic tribes, the Anglos, the Saxons, and the Jutes settled what became England and also the Scottish lowlands. And at the same kind of time, Scots, which was the word at the time for Irish people were moving from Ireland to what is now Scotland, what was then Pictland, in order to, and they started settling that way. And so the native British people were pushed out or displaced or Anglo-Saxonized in some cases, or Scottishized, but in some cases they remained, and specifically in places like Wales, which continued to be a British-speaking place. So the Anglo-Saxons, initially they're just kind of led by warlords, and they might have been mercenary groups and so forth, but they established for themselves little tiny kingdoms, what we call petty kingdoms, like Kent and East Anglia and Wessex and Mercia and Northumbria. Essentially, there said to be about 7 of these, and so it's traditionally called the Heptarchy, which just means the rule of 7 different petty kings, as Britain is divided amongst them. Actually, in this case, the Anglo-Saxon realms are divided into 7 rulers. There's a great myth from this time where Pope Gregory the Great, actually before he's a pope, he encounters these Anglo-Saxon boys, these golden-haired boys in Rome's slave market, and he asks, where are these boys come from? These are amazing. Where are these kids from? And somebody says, well, they're Angles. And he says, non Angli, they're not Angles, sed Angeli in Latin, which means to say they're not Angles, they're angels. And so it caught his eye apparently, or whatever. And so then the idea of it is that, considering the medieval papacy at this point is at a pretty low ebb and doesn't have a lot of resources, he really goes all out and sends a very significant mission to Kent to convert one of the Anglo-Saxon kings. And the reason that that the head of the church in England continues to be the capital of Kent, Canterbury, is because this mission happens where Gregory the Great sends Augustine of Canterbury to there and successfully converts the Kentish kingdom. So the Anglo-Saxons had been pagans. They convert through this means, and actually more so by the activities of Irish missionaries and so forth, but in part from Rome. And beginning as little warlords, there was actually very little difference between, let's say, the pagan king of Kent and his other warriors. They're also powerful warriors, and there really isn't anything necessarily separating him as the warlord or as the king from them. But the church had a real tradition of allying with kings, and they also routinely helped build up monarchies by setting kings apart, by doing special ceremonies, by giving their reign divine legitimacy, by trying to support stability within a realm and centralizing it and so forth. So actually, one of the reasons why pagan warlords converted was because they actually got a whole state-building apparatus in the church that came along with conversion. So, because of this way things worked out, as Vikings started raiding the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, the raiders destroyed a lot of the rival kingdoms like East Anglia and Mercia. So that left one of the kingdoms, Wessex, without rivals. And as the Danes were eventually kind of defeated, the kings of Wessex, as we mentioned, like with Alfred the Great, became the kings of all England. And that gave them significant customary powers, including the right to levy taxes in war. And so because of this big threat of the Danes, and because they had to either pay tribute in terms of by taxing all the people to get a Danegeld, money to pay the Danes to make them not attack you, or money to pay troops in order to fight the Danes, that gave the Anglo-Saxon kings a significant capacity to tax their people. In the north, the kings of the Scots were also able to unify a diverse group of petty kingdoms into what became known as Scotland. And that included Bernicia, which is the northern part of the kingdom of Northumbria, which is to say, not all of the people in Scotland were originally or ever really did speak Scots Gaelic, which is to say the Irish language that came with the Scots from Ireland. Some of them had originally spoken Pictish and British languages, like was spoken in Strathclyde and so forth, and some of them were speaking English to begin with, or Anglo-Saxon, because they're Northumbrians and so forth. So it was always a diverse kingdom, Scotland. So, monarchy, like I said, it's a deeply personal institution operating within the bounds of tradition and custom. A strong king can establish new powers that become customs, but a weak king can see existing powers atrophy through disuse. So even though a strong kingdom of the Anglo-Saxons of England emerged. Once you get to kind of a bad king like Ethelred II, a guy who is known as Ethelred the Unready because of what a bad king he was. Unready doesn't mean he wasn't prepared. What it actually means is person who has been miscounseled, or in other words, a guy who doesn't have any good counsel. So his name in Anglo-Saxon means the person who has wise counsel, but he's called Ethelred anyway, with the uncounseled. Ethelred used his taxation power to pay tribute to the Danish kings in order to avoid war, but he ultimately had to fight those wars and lost the war to the Danish king, who successfully replaced him as king. He died and Ethelred came back, but then Ethelred lost again and the Danes took the throne. So during that rule by Danish kings, the power of earls increased and it became concentrated in the hands of the nobility, in this case the hands of the Godwinson clan. So monarchy necessarily operates in partnership with other stakeholders, and that's usually, this includes the church. We've mentioned how the church can help out, but also the great nobles are usually also the central partners with the crown. And so while the Danes, who are kind of foreigners who have to go back to Denmark every once in a while and so forth, are ruling England, the great nobles, the earls, start to become super powerful. And meanwhile, also, the earldoms become hereditary within certain leading noble families, especially the Godwinson family. And so when the Danish kind of dynasty dies out and Ethelred's young exiled son, Edward, is brought back to England and becomes king. He becomes King Edward the Confessor, the guy who is king up until 1066, and the amazing events that are going to happen in 1066. He nevertheless has very little power because so much power has now come into the hands of the earls, and especially the Godwinson family. And indeed, Edward has to marry one of the Godwinson daughters as his queen, and she also is very holy, and so she believes in abstinence, and so they don't actually have kids, and so that also weakens the monarchy again against the nobles. So when Edward died childless, the English Witan, the council, chose, not as a cousin or a member of the House of Essex, a young man named Edgar Atheling, that's what we're talking about, which meant the early word for Anglo-Saxon prince, right, as an Atheling, and instead chose the king's brother-in-law, the queen's brother, Harold Godwinson, as his successor. So Harold becomes Harold II, King of England, and he rules during 1066. But because Harold isn't part of the traditional royal family, he's not from the House of Wessex, he's just from a noble family that has now been, made king, his position is relatively weak, and he has to fight off two foreign claimants who are trying to seize the throne. So there's King Harald Hardrada of Norway, who is basing his claim on being related to the old Danish dynasty that has a claim to the throne, and Duke William of Normandy, who he's also by marriage related to the old House of Wessex, but is not actually a descendant of that. Anyway, Harold successfully fought off King Harald Hardrada, but then when William of Normandy at the Battle of Hastings defeated him and he died in that battle, Harold died, William became the conqueror. So this allowed for kind of a monarchy reset in England. So the Norman conquest changed everything. Initially, much of the Anglo-Saxon nobility and clergy remained in place. In other words, they accepted William I as their king. But then later, there were rebellions and risings where many of the Anglo-Saxon lords and so forth turned on William and were mostly all exterminated and replaced. And at that point, and also over time, the clergy, the Anglo-Saxon clergymen also, began to die out, for their roles as bishops, and the Normans brought people from France, from Normandy, in order to restock the bishopric and so forth. So because of this change, unlike in France, the nobility in England, who were Normans who were transplanted there, they lacked autonomous fiefs. So whereas if you were the Count of Blois in France, you'd own the area, the county of Blois, and you'd have castles there, and the King of France can't even actually enter into your lands because it's kind of a very autonomous fief. Whereas in England at this point, if you were made Earl of Suffolk, you might have like one central castle or something, manor or something like that in Suffolk, but your lands would be spread all around England. And so it's not easy for you to simply barricade yourself behind your castles and have a rebellion, because anytime you join a rebellion, your lands could be seized because you don't have one like central place where you're fighting to control them and so forth. So it gives the kings a lot of power in vis-a-vis the nobility after the conquest. So nevertheless, it does, it requires having actual heirs in order to make things happen. And so William the Conqueror, passed his crown first to his son William II, William Rufus, and then later, when William Rufus died childless, the crown passed to his younger brother Henry I. Henry I had a son named William, and he's called William Adelin, which is actually the Norman version of that old Anglo-Saxon word for prince, atheling, or prince in the sense of son of the king. So William Adelin. But in a terrible disaster, both William and all of the other young nobles of the realm, they were on a ship. They were trying to cross between England and Normandy. The ship, they got drunk and so forth. The ship crashed into a rock, and everybody drowned. And so that ended all his plans for the future and so forth. He had an heir. The only heir that he has left, and the only child that he has left, is his daughter, Matilda. She's known as the Empress Matilda because she had previously been married to a Holy Roman Emperor, but that emperor had died while she was still quite young. She subsequently married a powerful French count, the Count of Anjou. Henry called upon all of his nobles to acknowledge Matilda as heir. And so if you've been watching the new House of Dragon, the new Game of Thrones story, this is actually based on the Empress Matilda story. And it doesn't go well in the actual history. So anyway, what ends up happening is when Henry dies, his nephew, Stephen, who is also a descendant of William the Conqueror, usurps the throne, and that leads to a 15-year civil war in England called the Anarchy between the supporters of Stephen and the supporters of Matilda. So that's the kind of thing that can cause royal authority to collapse or evaporate. So in other words, because the king is unable to maintain peace, and there's a rival king for everyone to rebel against the king and turn to, that could ultimately lead to all of the local earldoms or whatever in England becoming semi-autonomous or independent, something that had previously happened in France, which had led to kind of the collapse of royal authority in France at this contemporary time. But in order to end the civil war, King Stephen, after his eldest son died, he disinherited his younger son and instead named Matilda's son Henry as his heir. And so that kind of healed the civil war, and when Stephen died a couple years later, Henry just succeeded, and that ended the whole crisis. So Henry came to the throne in 1154 as a young and vigorous king, and he immediately set about restoring royal authority, and he was doing it according to the customs that had been current in his grandfather's day. So everything was to be done as it was in the days of old good King Henry, as he would have said. So as Henry II. So how does this work then? Henry then went about systemizing past customs, and in doing that, he actually led to the development of English common law. So he made reforms where they got going, where English justice started working on legal precedents and so forth. In other words, where they recorded customs and started basing new future judgments on customs. That ended up creating kind of the English system of common law. He tried to do a similar thing with church customs, but his attempts to kind of write down royal prerogatives over the church, his ability to appoint bishops and so forth, that led him into conflict with his former friend Thomas Becket, a guy who had been his chancellor, who he actually named to the position of Archbishop of Canterbury. They'd gotten into a huge fight, and at the end of which Becket is actually murdered by Henry's barons in Canterbury, which caused, a huge scandal, and Becket ultimately is canonized as a saint and so forth. And it took a lot for Henry to kind of recover from from this kind of a low point in his public relations and so forth. So, as bishops were important royal officials, kings often claimed the right to nominate candidates. And at this kind of period of time, the church is trying to free itself from royal control. And so this is part of the overall fight that's happening. So we had this system where Henry, for example, who had inherited vast lands in France. So by his father, he's already Count of Anjou, Touraine, and Maine. By his mother, he's Duke of Normandy and King of England. And by his wife, he inherits this vast territory, almost all of southern France, called the Duchy of Aquitaine, including the County of Poitou and the Duchy of Bordeaux and so forth. And so as a result of that, Henry and his sons and successors, Richard the Lionhearted and John, they owned richer lands with more people in them in France than they had in England. And so although they were technically vassals of the Capetian kings of France, they actually had way more power and wealth than the kings of France, who were pretty much restricted to the area around Paris, Orleans, and so forth. In other words, it was a much smaller kind of domain that they were having. So had this situation of an absentee monarchy continued, it's very possible that royal authority in England could have passed to local officials, since the kings are not really spending much time there. However, there's one big battle in 1214, the Battle of Bouvines, which actually sets all of the different monarchies of Europe in different directions and changed everything in history. If it had gone a different way, everything might have been different. So the King of France, Philip II, called Philip Augustus, and his ally, he is on the one side is King Philip of France. On the other side is the Guelph, or previously Pope-Papal, Holy Roman Emperor Otto IV, ally of King John, is on the other side. And they fight a battle in which Philip actually wins, which, like I say, kind of sets the course of history for the monarchies of France, England, Germany, and Italy. And even though this is a real big battle between Philip and John actually fails to even show up for the battle, and so he loses the battle without actually even arriving. So the Emperor Otto is there, but again, loses to the French king. So as a result of that, Philip was able to seize almost all of John's land in France, everything except for parts of the Aquitaine inheritance. And the French monarchy became rich and was able to centralize royal authority. And so as a result of that, France got put on a path of power continually being concentrated into the monarch's hands until we get to the early modern era, when the Sun King, Louis XIV, successfully implements a regime of absolute monarchy. And so sort of famously, having done that, Louis' successor, Louis XV, is sort of famous as saying, après nous le déluge. So in other words, after us, the flood can happen. It doesn't really matter. And although that's taken out of context, it's hard not to repeat that, because obviously when his successor, Louis XVI, is executed in 1793 in the French Revolution. So in other words, France centralizes, becomes a nation state, the monarch becomes an absolute monarch, and then in revolution, the monarchies gets wiped out. Course of history also changes for the empire. In other words, the monarchy of Germany and Italy. So the Emperor Otto IV was from the House of Welf, which is one of the competing imperial families. It's the only one actually to be crowned from the House of Welf. And so that is called Guelph in Italian. And Italians, which are part of the empire, part of the kingdom, so Otto is king of Germany, of Burgundy, and of Italy. In Italy, the family is called Guelph, and the rival party in Italy, the imperial party, that's the papal party, the imperial party is called Ghibelline, and that is from the houses of Hohenstaufen. And so even though Otto was from the Guelph party, or the Welf party, he had actually broken with Pope Innocent III. Innocent is probably the most powerful pope in history. He's at the pinnacle of power of the medieval papacy. Innocent was very haughty. Innocent had claimed all power to himself, and it was very difficult to be emperor and not to be continually humiliated and have to serve Innocent, who felt that the papacy was over top of secular rulers. So when Otto broke with Innocent, Innocent responded by replacing him with his ward, the young king Frederick II of Sicily, who was the Hohenstaufen prince. This ends up being a terrible strategic move by the Pope, but he does it at the time because he wants to spite Otto. Anyway, after Otto's defeat at the Battle of Bouvines, Frederick is able to pretty much seize control of the throne in Germany. Otto has to kind of slowly retire to his own castles and ultimately kind of die, deposed and powerless. So this ends up setting the popes and the emperors on a path of mutual destruction. So Innocent III here expands the authority of the papal monarchy to include successfully deposing emperors and appointing new people to be emperor in their stay. So that's very, very much setting himself up to essentially be paramount monarch over all the kings of Europe. He successfully deposed the emperor and replaced him. However, it proved very short-sighted in effect. So the person that he replaced Otto with, Frederick II of Hohenstaufen, was already king of Sicily, which included all southern Italy, so very rich. And now he becomes king of Burgundy and Germany and Italy. And so he now, from a very strong position, starts to try to really revive imperial or royal control of northern Italy, which caused the papacy to be entirely surrounded. And so later popes declared holy war against Frederick. And they ultimately succeeded in exterminating his house, the House of Hohenstaufens. And over time, the papacy actually successfully destroyed the power of the Roman emperors, the West Roman emperors, the Holy Roman emperors. And so the result is this. So we have like the map of, this is like, the empire, and it was a big monarchy and so forth. With the collapse of royal authority, everything balkanizes into these little microstates and so forth, which are all semi-autonomous. So while the papacy successfully exterminates the Hohenstaufens, they contribute to the complete breakdown of royal authority in Germany and Italy. And as that kind of happens, papal power also, over time, ebbed away. And so far from being paramount rulers, like in Innocent III, the later popes in the early modern era, their power declined against the much more powerful emerging nation states of Europe, so Spain and France and England and so forth. Okay, so that's what happened in France and what happened in Germany and Italy. Meanwhile, this Battle of Bouvines, the response in England. So having lost all of his lands, save part of his mother's lands in Aquitaine, King John retreated to England, and he proceeded to be a terrible king there too. And so he offends and he quarrels with all of his barons, all of the nobility in England. And so between 1214 and 1216, many of his barons were in active revolt. And in the middle of that, in 1215, John was forced to sign a great charter of liberties, the Magna Carta. that guaranteed the rights of the nobility. It's not really about the people of England, but the nobles, against arbitrary exercise of authority by the king. And so this becomes a big turning point in the relationship between monarchy and nobles. John, of course, as a liar he always is, he repudiated Magna Carta, and the war continued, but he was nearly deposed before he died. But rather than, since he did die, instead of he didn't have to be deposed. And so when his son, who's only 9 years old, Henry III, comes to the throne, the regents for him, so in other words, he's too young to be in charge of the government itself, the regents agree to reissue versions of the charter, edited down a little bit, versions of Magna Carta, and then that became a practice, just a regular practice when you come to the throne. So reissuing, the new king will reissue Magna Carta and so forth. So that becomes part of the medieval contract between the kings and the nobles. So thereafter, Magna Carta had a legal significance throughout the medieval period, as nobles were able to bring cases against royal officials, not the king himself, but essentially all of the officials that the king acted through when the king essentially was breaching the charter, Magna Carta. So from that kind of basis, now the kings of just England, over the course of the next centuries, war became increasingly expensive. And this was also a time period when England and France fought a very expensive conflict known as the 100 Years' War. The war took place between 1337 and 1453, so it actually lasted longer than 100 years. And so to pay for the war, English kings increasingly relied on gatherings called Parliament as a vehicle to legitimize special taxation. So parliaments began as meetings of the king and his chief ministers, members of the council, plus ecclesiastical magnates, so the bishops, archbishops, and abbots, and also lay magnates, so the earls and the lords and so forth. So knights and townsmen, representing the civic communes, the commons as it was called, were regularly included after the 1290s, although they were definitely initially a much subordinate part of the parliament from the lords, which are the lay and church magnates. By Edward III's era, so John's son is Henry, and Henry has a son Edward, who has a son Edward, who has a son Edward III. Consent of both the lords and commons was necessary for the king to levy any new tax. They could also put laws through the parliament that the king retained the right to veto and so forth, but you weren't able to make taxes independent of the lords and commons. So English kings who needed money often found Parliament to be a very convenient institution when the commons could be called in to vote to give taxes to pay for their expensive wards. However, those same kings found Parliament to be much less convenient when members of that Parliament complained to him, for example, of the heavy taxation, or when they demanded an accounting of royal expenditure. What did you do with all the last money we gave you? Or when they took it upon themselves to impeach the king's ministers for mismanagement of royal government and so forth. And so, in other words, there is a, Parliament giveth and Parliament taketh awayeth, on these things. In other words, the king is getting something for it, but it's also costing some of his authority. So Parliament then becomes a power check in an era that is becoming more philosophically promoting of absolutism and absolute monarchies. So as, for example, we're moving in France towards that era of Louis XIV and as the absolute ruler of France, there's still this very significant check that's preventing that from happening as much in England. So when the king and parliament were aligned, the body could enact laws that increased royal authority. So for example, under Henry VIII, the Act of Supremacy made the monarch the supreme head of the Church of England, and separated the English church from the papacy and the Bishop of Rome. However, when the monarch and the parliament disagree, the only thing that kings could more or less do is dissolve Parliament, dismiss Parliament, and then attempt and fail to live on their own royal revenues. In other words, they couldn't enact any new taxes, and so they had to make do with the other traditional ways that kings got money. So, for example, they were major landowners, and they were living off the agricultural produce of their own estates. They also had certain traditional rights and duties, import tariffs, export tariffs, and so forth. They had money and revenues from court fees, justice fees, and so forth. They could sell offices. They could, certain kinds of revenues that they could make from minting coinage or debasing coinage and so forth. But at a certain point, you have to you also need taxes. So when Queen Elizabeth I died without a direct heir, her cousin, King James VI of Scotland, was crowned as James I of England. James' son, Charles I, living a generation before Louis XIV, but again, as these ideas of absolutism are all around, he was very attracted to the philosophical ideas about divine right of kings and absolute monarchy. So in other words, that he shouldn't have to be bound by lesser people in terms of all of his judgments. And so at a certain point, after conflict and arguing with the Parliament, he decides to dissolve Parliament and tries to rule without it for 11 years. In other words, making up revenues through those kind of traditional ways that I was talking about without having to ask for special taxes. However, that ultimately, he does have some wars. Wars are too expensive to pay for out of ordinary revenue, and that bankrupts Charles. He's forced to recall Parliament in order to enact new taxes. Parliament is not in a good mood, having been dismissed for 11 years, and so relations between both the king and the Parliament deteriorate. Both the king and the Parliament raise armies, which begin fighting each other. The parliamentary forces end up defeating the royalists in the ensuing English Civil War. And once Charles is executed, once he's captured, he's also eventually executed in 1649. And so that led to the brief and only period of time when Britain operates as a republic. And during that time, it becomes kind of a military dictatorship where the chief of the army, Oliver Cromwell, is made the Lord Protector of the Commonwealth of England, Scotland, and Ireland. And he ultimately also tries to rule without Parliament. I put this slide in because whenever I think of the execution of the king, I think of regicide, and there's this wonderful crime hotline in Springfield that Bart calls, and it has all the to choose from a list of felonies, press 2, and so forth. You have selected regicide. If you know the name of the king or queen being murdered, press 1. Anyway, so this is a funny regicide. All right, regicide is more funny hundreds of years after the fact than it was at the time, I'm sure. So, after the collapse of the military protectorate, Parliament was recalled, and Parliament ultimately voted to restore the monarchy and invited Charles I's exiled son, who's living off in France, to return to England to be crowned as king, King Charles II. So while Charles II was able to reclaim a bunch of royal prerogatives, the real aftermath of the Civil War, where England had gone ahead and committed regicide and had a republic era, pretty much kind of permanently shifted dynamics and the power dynamics in favor of Parliament. So Parliament was also, and the main English political leaders are also very nervous about maintaining Anglicanism as separate from Catholicism, and unfortunately for Parliament, lots of members of the royal family had Catholic leanings, including Charles's brother James. So they'd been living all these years in exile in France. France is a Catholic country and so forth, so they've adopted or readopted Catholicism. Parliament tries unsuccessfully to exclude James from the succession, so he does become king when Charles dies. But Parliament sort of kind of is feeling like, or the Protestant leaders in England are sort of feeling like, well, it's not going to last too long. He'll eventually die, and his daughter Mary, who is a Protestant and is married to a Protestant leader from the Netherlands, will be his heir. However, kind of unexpectedly, James, who is married to a new Catholic wife, she gives birth to a son, which displaces Mary in the primogeniture, right? So a son trumps daughters in this kind of era. And so that raises the specter that there's going to be, that the Stuarts are going to maintain, that became a completely Catholic dynasty ruling England. So as a result of this, kind of the political leaders in England, kind of the leaders of Parliament, invite Mary and her husband, William of Orange, to invade. And as they do, and as they throw England open to her, James decides to flee to France. And so James and his family leave, and Parliament then convenes and declares that he's forfeited the throne, and they acclaim William and Mary as joint monarchs. So this leads to the kind of the pathway now to the atrophy of royal power. So from the reigns of Mary II and William II, Parliament assumes control of the succession, and they exclude all kinds of Catholic claimants from the line. So after William's death and Mary's relative Anne dies, they have to go to kind of a very distant German cousin, the Elector of Hanover, George I, who became king in 1714. People often are talking about George that he didn't even know English, and so he was therefore alienated from his government. Actually, pretty much everybody in the government could speak French. He could speak French. Over time, he eventually learned English, probably, but the issue still was that royal power atrophied under him, as he was not part of, born to this system, and he was still interested in ruling his own lands back in Germany and so forth. And so, as a result, power really began under him to pass to Britain's first de facto prime minister, Robert Walpole. So over time, that just kind of continued that tradition. So George I's grandson, George III, suffered from porphyria, probably, we think, which is to say, which was understood at the time to be fits of insanity that rendered him unable to rule. And so his son, William, was made regent. And during that regency period, and then later when William became king, as William IV, the royal ability to influence Parliament declined further. So, for example, in 1834, William decided to dismiss his prime minister, who was from the Whig party, and he replaced him with somebody he liked better from the Tory party. But then when the elections were held, the Tories lost the elections, and so the king really had no choice if he wanted to have Parliament do anything but to recall the Whig prime minister that he'd fired. So in other words, the king is no longer able to have his choice as to who the prime minister was going to be. The final transition to constitutional monarchy, from an entirely constitutional ceremonial role, occurred during the 63-year-long reign of Victoria, who is a granddaughter of George III. So after many of her uncles all died without producing heirs, male heirs, Victoria assumed the throne. She also had little control at this point, even at the beginning. But after the death of her really beloved husband, Prince Albert, she went into kind of a very serious mourning and retreated from public life for decades. And so her almost entirely ceremonial role became entirely ceremonial, which really set the precedence for much of the modern British monarchy as it exists today. So then at that point, the most strange thing, once the British monarchy doesn't have any power at all, was simply not getting eliminated, right? And so Britain, the monarchy, actually survived revolutions that other much seemingly stronger or more powerful monarchs in Europe did not survive. So George V of Great Britain, who's pictured here on the right, he's with his first cousin, Tsar Nicholas II of Russia. They also, at the same time, we don't have a picture of all three of them together, but anyway, they were also first cousins of the German Kaiser Wilhelm II. So in contrast to George, who had very little power, as an entirely ceremonial role, a constitutional monarch, Tsar Nicholas and Kaiser Wilhelm, actually, they wielded a lot of power. They were sort of running their own nations, but both were overthrown after the serious military losses that the Russian Empire and then the German Empire both experienced in World War I, which eliminated those two monarchies. So that kind of brings us, to the conclusion of that. And so I just want to conclude by just kind of thinking about here, well, what quality then makes monarchy distinct? So given that the quality that separates monarchs from other heads of states is not power, we've seen that they can have all power or none, nor is it whether the state is a democracy or an autocracy. And to have a monarch, as we've seen with the subnational monarchs, it's not even necessary for people to have a recognized state. Nor it is a question about election or inheritance, since some monarchs are elected. So what is the essential distinction? And so I think that the answer is almost just a sense or a feeling that people have within a realm that the monarchy has some kind of legitimacy. So in the British case, and also even in the Commonwealth Realms, Elizabeth II was queen for so long, the overwhelming majority of all of her subjects had never experienced anyone else in that role. She provided kind of a long, very steady presence. And I think that was coupled with a general sense that she was continually fulfilling duties. It's just a ceremonial role, but she's always doing that. and I think that, especially when I talk to older generation of Canadians, that endowed her with a kind of a well of goodwill, that really I don't think that Charles, enjoys at all, because nobody has that sense. He's it's weird and new that this particular guy is there, right? So monarchies, in terms of legitimacy, how do you get legitimacy? Monarchies accrue legitimacy by longevity. So we've seen the British monarchy is 1,000 years old and include precursors that go back centuries more. The papacy is nearly 2,000 years old. The Japanese monarchy claims to be older still. So most monarchic traditions are also intertwined with religion, like we've seen. The British coronation that was just held is essentially an Anglican church mass, and it was effectively like kind of like the sacrament of installing the new head of the Church of England. So, for this reason, because of the legitimacy gap, autocrats rarely crown themselves. So dictators frequently seize absolute power in states, and they start living in palaces. They may create personality cults. They'll put their picture on money and on posters and walls and everything like that, and they promote themselves and their praise and so forth through state-controlled media. Nevertheless, it seems like it's nearly impossible for a new man, somebody who had originally been a regular commoner or bureaucrat or military person or something, to kind of rise up, assume power, and successfully name themselves king. They may be king in all but name, but that name remains elusive. Putin has a lot of trappings, but he's not able to be named czar, right? Even if he'd like to be. Or hasn't anyway, so far tried. The one exception that kind of proves that rule is perhaps Napoleon. So his foray into this was potentially like one of the greatest military commanders in history, and so having like a unprecedented military success in terms of conquering most of Europe. He took the title emperor and then successfully intermarried all the members of his family into all the traditional royal houses of Europe, which kind of caused a legitimacy there by marriage, so by military prowess as a form, and then also intermarriage with the legitimate, or let's say historic traditional monarchs. But and in part that's because I think there's a traditional association between monarchs and the military, and so success on the battlefield is a source of legitimacy. Nevertheless, as Napoleon also proves, with Waterloo, that if you live by the sword, that you can also die by the sword, and so you could lose that same legitimacy through loss. So Charles, like I say, lacks the reservoir of goodwill that his mother had amassed over the decades. The British monarchy continues to possess antiquity, but some of these other sources of legitimacy seem to be running dry. So, in general, class distinction based on inheritance has become deeply unpopular in the West. That's true in England too, where even though there has always been a more formal class system, that has also been being challenged anyway in Britain. Certainly meant to be challenged in like the American mythos. Nor is religion the help it once was. So, for example, in a 2018 survey, only 14% of the people in the United Kingdom identify as Anglican Christian, although it depends on the survey methodology. Sometimes a lot more of them will call themselves Anglicans, even if they don't go to church or anything like that. Nevertheless, there's some cautionary tales about, when you just decide, well, let's get rid of monarchy. So in crafting the U.S. Constitution in 1787, the founding fathers of the United States, they rejected monarchy. Nevertheless, for the American people, they imbued some of the feeling associated with the monarch in this new office they created of presidency. And so because the president is on the one hand both the head of government in a way and the head of state, there are problems, when a society like the U.S. today becomes hyper-polarized. And so people in the one partisan side and the other partisan side cannot view the president from the opposite party as being their president, essentially. And so that's an issue too. I recently gave a whole paper on this idea of monarchy, and in terms of looking at the leadership of the church, my church that I'm a part of, Community of Christ, and the Latter-day Saint tradition that it forms a part of. And so we have had a tradition in Community of Christ where the leadership, the presidency of the church, has actually been within a particular family up until the 1990s. And so Joseph Smith, who was the original founder of the church, went to his son, and then three of his sons, so the grandsons of the founder, until the great-grandson of the founder, when he retired and became emeritus president and prophet of the church in 1996, he appointed somebody outside of the family as the new president. And so that was the first time that we moved away from this traditional family Smith dynasty or whatever, even in the leadership of that. And so we are considering that now, after the second non-Smith president of our church has announced his retirement, which will take place in 2 years. And so we are looking to how are we going to be a people that is kind of maybe more constitutional, or have more of a constitutional monarchy, or maybe more of a republic with our World Conference here, which is the elected council or the leadership of the church, the parliament. Maybe it is the sovereign as opposed to the presidency. So it's something that I've been thinking about. So this is my thoughts anyway on monarchy, past and present. And just as a final reflection here, again, in Canada, the system of having a British monarch as the head of state of one's own very non-British country is increasingly becoming, it seems, a bizarre tradition. And so it's one that, I'm still thinking about. I had become I watched the Queen's speech as part of the Christmas Day tradition and things like that. It was really strange to have it be Charles who gave the speech this last year, and also to have the little kids choir singing "God Save the King," since I was, again, like I say, used to Elizabeth II, and I haven't been used to him yet. So those are my thoughts on monarchy, past and present. Sorry we were not able to get this lecture last week, but hopefully it was worth the wait. I'm going to see here if Leandro has given me some of your questions and comments. And so, Rain says, I'd say North Korea is a nascent dictatorial monarchy. What do you think? Yeah, so that's North Korea is such an interesting position. I was saying how it's really difficult for, let's say, a new man in a republic, somebody who rises from the ranks and becomes absolute leader or dictator or something like that, the way the first of the Kims did in North Korea. And so he was the head of a nominally socialist state, a communist state, but they have successfully created a dynasty. So his son took over, and then his son took over, and now, as you say, we really are getting to a place where there is a dynasty. You have still a nominal republic and a nominal communist socialist state, which is really but which has really become almost, like you say, a monarchy, even though it isn't claiming that name. And so but it's functionally become one, I think. So yes, it's very interesting. Tolkien Study asks, my question is the Pope a monarchy? So the Pope is a monarch. The papacy is a monarchy, and so yes, the papal. I mean, it's definitely a kind of monarch. So he's the head of a state. So the Vatican City, even though it's very tiny, is recognized internationally as an independent country. The Vatican is a successor state to a much larger papal state, which the popes ruled from around the 9th century onward until the 20th century. They lost it in the unification of Italy, but we're still claiming to own it until they were able to make a treaty finally with Mussolini that recognized their little state within Rome as the successor to that. In other words, they gave up claims to the rest of the city of Rome and the rest of the lands in central Italy that had been part of their state. But the popes have been recognized as a territorial prince since at least like the 9th century or so, the 10th century. And so as a result of that, they're a monarchy, and the country is a monarchy, and the popes are a monarch, a type of monarch. In the very same way, when when Islam expanded, the leader of the Islamic lands was the caliph, and so it's called the caliphate. And so that person was both the kind of the monarch, it's like the emperor, and also kind of like the pope. I mean, it's like both combined together. But then, like I say, slowly over time, their actual power over things atrophied, and so caliphs became more and more like just a religious leader. And then they had, their general, the head of the bureaucracy, and also of the armies and things like that. The sultans ended up taking, becoming the kind of the more secular king underneath the religious leader. But that's happened too with like let's say the Japanese Empire, right, where the emperor is sort of like the religious leader, and the and then the government has been ruled by, let's say, the military leaders like shoguns, and more recently, obviously, the secular democracy. Rain asks, why did the Romans have such a fear of kings after the fabled Rex Romani, and how did the Republican period inspire revolutionary reforms in Europe? So there was a big... So there was part, I think, central to the Roman foundational myth. The royal period is mostly mythic. There is some historical evidence for some of the kings and so forth, but essentially the Roman foundational myth was that they overthrew kings, and kings were a tyranny, and they had and instead had developed, their system of having a a res public, a public thing that was central to what it meant to be Roman. And so I think that the idea, certainly what the other senators, who were the people who were really expressing the fear of a monarchy. I don't know that the common people may not have cared about too much if it was a bunch of senators who were ruling them or one king. I don't know that they did care necessarily, the common people. The other senators were very very much disliked the idea of having one senator be in charge instead of all of them kind of sharing power. And so they were, I think, afraid of it out of self-interest, that they wanted to have that. How did the Republican period inspire future revolutionary forms in Europe? So so there had been primarily from the Antiquity and the Middle Ages onward, most all of the greater states, bigger states in Europe were monarchies, right? So they were almost all kingdoms or empires or principalities or something like that. But the exceptions were there were city-state size kind of republics in Italy and other places like that, and so they were smaller but they were more attuned also. So they, like in the Renaissance and so forth, they're looking back at the Roman models, and so they are looking into classical forms, and so they're aware of some of the the ancient, like Cicero's discussion of a republic and so forth. And so they are directly inspired in that way by the classical forms, in that kind of time period. Rain, would Prince Harry and Meghan Markle's children still qualify as heirs to the British throne if their parents give up their British citizenship and immigrate? Yeah, I think so. I think that the way it works is, so the succession isn't really Harry or Meghan or their children's under their power. Parliament is in charge, and so Parliament has an act that regulates the succession that works by absolute primogeniture. And so the only way that those guys would get taken out of the succession is by an act of Parliament. And so it doesn't really matter if they. I don't think it would matter if. I think if they did renounce their citizenship and so forth, then maybe Parliament would say, well, then you can't be king, and they might make an act. But it would be Parliament that does it, not them, because the Parliament's in charge. Miguel Angelo says, is from Henry II, in terms of in the Becket affair, is that where we get the phrase where, will no one rid me of this turbulent priest, of this troublesome priest? Yes, so that's the famous line that's attributed to Henry II. And so Henry has had this horrible knockdown, drag-out fight with Becket, and it's been a big thorn in his side. Becket has spent most of his time as Archbishop of Canterbury in exile and so forth, and so Henry's not able to get all kinds of work done. He's not able to have... the Archbishop of Canterbury, speaking of monarchy and the church, the traditional prerogative of crowning the King of England is supposed to fall to the Archbishop of Canterbury. And so usually if the person is going to be crowned, like Charles III was, you want the Archbishop of Canterbury to do it. Well, Becket is in exile and he's an enemy of Henry. Henry is looking over at the Capetians and seeing how strong that monarchy is because they crown their son in the lifetime. So Henry takes his son, who we call the young King Henry, and he has him crowned, but he can't. He's wanting to get Becket or whatever. He can't do it, so he has the Archbishop of York crown him instead, which is a problem in terms of his son's legitimacy. We call him young King Henry because he actually dies before Henry II, and so he doesn't ever become. He's not Henry III. He doesn't get a number because he's never adult king. He was crowned in Henry II's lifetime, and so yes, at the end of this whole time period, Henry is supposed to have said, "Will no one rid me of this troublesome priest?" In other words, just kind of throwing that out in the air, as opposed to like saying, "You guys, you go kill him," but rather just saying an act of despair, and then the barons put it two and two together, and they decided to go do it. And so it is a little bit of plausible deniability on Henry's part or whatever, but he still got in trouble for the assassination. Rain asks, how do Western monarchies compare to South and Central American god emperors like Moctezuma or Queen Liuokalani of Hawaii? Um, so I would have to research more about the Aztec emperors and so forth. I know so there would have been a big again, I know that there's a big, religious component to there, and same thing with the Mayan rulers. So there's a king of every one of the Mayan city-states, and they would have been ruling in concert with their local priests and something like that in those cases. So in those monarchies have similarities between the Western monarchies in the sense that the the king has a lot of divine right, and that's, like you say, completely associated with that and with the priesthood. And also, I think similarities are, a military function in that same way. In terms of Hawaii, the Hawaiian monarchy, by the time it gets to the last queen, has actually been in a lot of contact with Western monarchies and also with the Japanese monarchy. And so the king and queen of Hawaii traveled to England at one point. And so I think that at a certain point the monarchy becomes very influenced by European and to some extent maybe Japanese monarchy too. And so it evolved very rapidly from first contact to the end of the Hawaiian monarchy. So Daryl Scott says, it seems like the idea of divine right was a very big deal in the past. What role does the divine right play in monarchies today? So yeah, absolutely. It wasn't always, because like I say, in kind of like the pre-monarchies, the pagan monarchies, war chiefs and things like that probably relied less on divine right, but it's an idea that evolved in the Middle Ages and became really important, and it actually even becomes even more important in early modern times when divine right is sort of becomes tied up with the idea that in the early modern era there becomes this idea that everything is about voluntism, that God's will is the most important thing. And the monarch is kind of seen as an earthly analogy of that. And so even kind of secular philosophers like the Leviathan is talking about a political theory where all kind of law and authority has to emerge from the monarch. I think that the idea of divine right has died down. It's still there, present in lots of the monarchies, and the King of England is still the head of the church, and obviously the Pope is the head of a religion, and there's an association too with the Japanese emperor and the religion, the King of Thailand and the religion there. So they're definitely still intertwined, but I think that that there is also now, like Dennis, the peasant, says in Monty Python, that supreme executive authority really has to rely on a mandate from the masses. So in other words, that the real legitimacy is not that somewhere there's some sign that God has called this king to be the king, but rather that that the authority really has to come from the consent of the people, I think, and so that has undercut the more old-fashioned divine right theory. Raymond Ortiz says, was Jesus descended from royalty? So the evangelists, the authors of Matthew and Luke, claim that Jesus is descended from the Judean royal house, the house of David. There is no historical evidence for that. Those genealogy lists are the inventions of the evangelists. And so there is a religious claim that Jesus is descended from royalty, but there is no historical basis for that. Robert Garrison says, is there any chance that Community of Christ could pick another descendant of Joseph Smith to be the new president. There is a chance. I mean, we have lots of descendants of Joseph Smith who are members of the church and leaders of the church. So, for example, a good friend of mine, Locke Mackay, is a direct descendant of Joseph and Emma Smith. He is one of the church's 12 apostles right now. He would be perfectly qualified to be a president of the church in the future, and so that could happen. And there are many other women and men who are descended from Joseph Smith who are members of the church. It's not likely to be done as a qualification, though. In other words, it would be that they're going to be picked anyway, and they just happen to be a Smith, is what I would say it would happen. Grycycle says, does the U.S. have an oligarchy now because of unlimited bribery? Yeah. So, part of the issue, there's a huge income inequality, and because of the amazing power of the unelected U.S. Supreme Court, the U.S. Supreme Court has ruled that money is speech, and so people can more or less, just use money in unlimited ways that mean that the upcoming presidential election, on both sides, the candidates are each going to have to raise and spend $2 billion each. It's just an insane amount of waste of money, but that's how it has to happen because of this ruling that money is speech and that nothing can be regulated and everything like that. Michelangelo says, why wasn't it common for monarchs to just name worthy successors outside of their family? Why do people consider that they're children of kings who would become good kings? Yeah, so in fact, so in the case of the Roman Empire, there never was one succession thing that worked. They would occasionally become dynasties, but the dynasty didn't always maintain itself, and so it was always possible for, let's say, a general on the edge of the empire to be declared emperor and to march to Rome and or Constantinople later to become emperor. And so one of the best periods of time, like the reign of the good emperors, is so called because there was a succession of emperors who did just what you're talking about. So they found the most, let's say, the best potential candidate, in their opinion, of somebody who's most qualified to be emperor. They adopted the guy. They brought him, as kind of a assistant emperor, and then I don't think that they abdicated, but I think that when they died, then that person became the emperor, and so they had the really good run going by doing just that. Why do people think that the children of kings will make good kings? So I think that on the one hand, it's not necessarily that people think that the children of the kings are going to be a good king, but that it's a king often thinks of their kids themselves as living on in their kids. I think a lot of people have children and they sort of think of themselves in their children, and they think of themselves as having a legacy through biological children. And so in the same way that like a person who starts a family company often wants to pass that company down in the family, could be a family tradition or any number of family things that is also part of a tradition in monarchy, right? And in terms of the legitimacy, a lot of times, for like let's say that divine right stuff, or the thinking that the person is elevated and different from the rest of us, is if they are born in the purple, if they are born to this august dynasty, you can maybe believe that they are they're king by the grace of God or something like that. And so I think that that's been part of it. Dunny Loon Gringo asks, can a minority movement, he's using the MAGA movement in the USA as an example, could that be put in place a new permanent presidency of a new man? Does history suggest that might happen in a republic or a democracy? So I think that it would be hard to have a permanent presidency in the U.S. So the U.S. has has a bunch of different legal constitutional checks and balances, and even though there have been like a crazy amount of abrogation of all kinds of norms and the rule of law and everything like that, it's still surprising how remarkably resilient the U.S. legal system is. So we probably won't get, by the time this year is over, Donald Trump is probably going to be indicted, on several more serious charges. So in Georgia, and also federal charges, and he's also will have faced, let's say, a civil trial that will potentially wipe out his company and so forth. I mean, so there have been major consequences, even though it takes a long time for these legal consequences to happen. I don't think it would be very possible to just simply just declare we're now having a permanent presidency, because it doesn't operate that way. I think there's all these norms that I think it would be very difficult to see that happen. Well, we'll see. Andrew Surali says, given how so many legal institutions in the UK are tied to the actual person of the monarch, at least in principle, how hard do you think it would be for them to transition if they ever abolish the monarchy? I think it would be really difficult. I think it's actually still really would be pretty difficult to transition away from the monarchy here in Canada. It actually would be a very complicated set of constitutional hoops to try to make that happen. So I think that would be a big deal. I think it would be a way bigger deal in England, and it would be very difficult. And I don't know that there is a huge appetite for it. So in other words, there's a big bunch of inertia too, because like you say, so much is kind of taken up in it. I think that what could happen is that there will be a bunch of additional reforms. People might have to, they might have to disclose how much, like the private expenditures, all the kinds of money that is tied up in the monarchy right now. So it's not entirely clear how much money King Charles has and so forth, because a lot of it is all tied up in private things that are not accessible and so forth. So I think that there could be all kinds of reforms which would have effects that would be well shy of eliminating the monarchy. I want to thank Michelangelo, Daryl Scott, and Andrew Surali for supporting the channel. Thanks so much. Andrew Surali says, on the subject of the Archbishop of Canterbury and the divine right of monarchy, do you think the recent GAFCON, Global Fellowship of Confessing Anglicans, split in the Anglican Communion will have an effect on the perceived legitimacy of the British monarchy? Yeah, so it is complicated. I think that the Anglican Communion, is having this the split where in the developing world there's way more conservatism on some social issues, inclusion and so forth, and then that is finding reactionary and conservative supporters in places like Canada and the US and England and so forth. And so that is causing a schism like there is in lots of the Protestant denominations. And so, I think that it is complicated, because how do you, the Archbishop of Canterbury in a way is simply first among equals among the Anglican commune, but if you're split and very divided on central issues, it's more difficult for the king to be the head of the whole thing. So it may well be that the Anglican commune ultimately divides and is not in any kind of communion with itself, in the same way that, for example, Russian Orthodoxy has been increasingly estranged from the rest of Eastern Orthodoxy right now. Rain asks, as opposed to the kingdom of God, why is Satan often identified as Prince of Air or Prince of Darkness? Is Satan's depiction as a wicked king biblically based? So, that's interesting. So there really is no Satan as the cosmic. We have a whole lecture on Satan and the origin of Satan. There's really not present. Satan is not really present in the Old Testament. There are later, it's a later idea, a cosmic principle of evil that is read into the Old Testament. There are references to some of the titles then that get appropriated by Satan in the Old Testament, and some of those are referring to actual monarchs, so like the Prince of Babylon or something like that. And so in that sense, maybe that's where some of that is coming from. As the idea gets developed later on, Satan is usually understood to be a fallen angel who has excuse me, has usurped, trying to usurp the kingdom of God. And so maybe the idea of it is that he's actually prince of the king, of a negative principality of evil. And so it's if his title would only be one of a usurper or having created a false kingdom that's in rebellion against God or something like that. All right. Well, so that's all the questions that we're going to have time for. I'm going to invite you, once again, if you are interested in supporting these lectures, you can go to centerplace.ca/donate. We are going to have the new lectures coming up. So remember, not next week, but 2 weeks from now, we're going to have a lecture on the first 2 books of Maccabees, the apocryphal books of Maccabees. And then the week after that, we're going to talk about Second Enoch, so a pseudepigraphal book of Enoch, sometimes called The Secrets of Enoch. Again, thank you for your support. Thanks to Greicycle for your support. And I'm going to say goodnight.